At her sister's wedding, the adopted woman was humiliated in front of everyone. But no one expected the groom to stand up and do it. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what country you are from. The morning began like most others in Kira's world, before the sun had even risen, before the streets buzzed with cars and impatient horns, before the city's breath turned warm with industry. The alarm on her old prepaid phone rattled on the edge of the chipped nightstand, its shrill tone cutting through the heavy quiet of the apartment. Kira reached over, silenced it with a practiced swipe, and allowed herself a brief moment of stillness. Her eyes remained closed as she listened to the faint wheeze of the radiator and the slow, steady breathing of her daughter in the next room. Moments like this were rare, quiet, uninterrupted, and fleeting. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her feet landing on the frayed edge of a worn-out rug. Her back ached from the double shift she'd pulled the night before, and her knees creaked as she stood. The apartment was cold despite the radiator's valiant effort, and she wrapped her faded robe tighter around her waist as she moved to the bathroom. The mirror above the sink, cracked in one corner, reflected a tired woman with eyes too old for her 32 years. Kira didn't dwell. There wasn't time. She splashed her face with water that took too long to warm, brushed her teeth with quick, mechanical precision, and tied her hair back into a bun. By the time she reached the kitchen, a cramped, dim space with yellowing tiles and a humming fridge, she was already mentally preparing for the long day ahead. From the adjacent room, a soft voice called out, muffled by the blanket, "Mom?" Kira turned. "I'm here, baby." 7-year-old Lonnie peeked her head out from under the covers, her curly hair a halo around her sleepy face. She offered a drowsy smile, and Kira's chest warmed in the way it always did when she looked at her daughter. Lonnie was her reason, her anchor. Every ache, every humiliation, every unpaid bill was bearable as long as Lonnie was safe and smiling. "You ready to get dressed?" Kira asked. Lonnie nodded, and together they moved through their morning routine. Kira reheated rice and beans from the night before, portioned out a small container of fruit she'd saved for Lonnie's lunch, and packed her daughter's school bag with care. Lonnie, in her second-hand jacket and scuffed sneakers, looked up at her with wide, intelligent eyes. "I'm going to finish my science project today," she said proudly. "We're making a model of the solar system." Kira kissed the top of her daughter's head. "That's my little genius. Just remember, Pluto might not be a planet anymore." Lonnie laughed. "It's still my favorite." They stepped out into the cold just as the sun began to stretch its fingers across the sky. Kira walked Lonnie to school, holding her hand tightly, scanning the street for speeding cars and the occasional loitering stranger. At the school gates, Lonnie hugged her mother tightly and whispered, "Don't forget to eat today." Kira smiled, trying not to show how much those words meant. "I won't. Go be brilliant." The moment Lonnie disappeared into the crowd of children, Kira turned and headed toward the bus stop. She worked the morning shift at Patty's, a small, greasy spoon of a diner tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. Patty, the owner, was a loud woman with a permanent cigarette in hand and an uncanny ability to ignore labor laws. Kira had been bussing tables and scrubbing floors there for 3 years. It wasn't much, but it was steady, at least when Patty wasn't cutting hours without notice. Today was payday, which meant Kira would be handed an envelope of cash, counted out to the cent without deductions, without a contract. It also meant pretending not to hear the cook's inappropriate comments, or Patty's passive-aggressive jabs about being one of the dependable ones. Kira never responded. She knew silence was often the only armor she had. Her shift passed in a blur of clattering dishes, spilled coffee, and aching feet. On her short break, she sat in the alley behind the diner with a plastic container of leftover pancakes and a bottle of tap water. She checked her phone. No new messages. 2 missed calls from unknown numbers she suspected were debt collectors, and 1 school email about a fundraising event she couldn't afford to participate in. By 3 p.m., she was racing to pick up Lonnie, her uniform still smelling faintly of grease and onions. Lonnie came bounding out of the school, her face bright. "I showed Miss Jensen my model. She said it was creative." Kira's smile was tired but real. Of course she did. They stopped at the corner store on the way home to pick up milk and bread. The cashier gave Kira a wary glance, as always. She ignored it. At home, after Lanny's homework was done and dinner was cooked, a pot of lentil soup and toast, Kira prepared for her second job. She changed into dark, loose-fitting clothes, tied her hair under a cap, and packed her cleaning supplies into a backpack. Lanny curled up on the couch with a book, her blanket pulled to her chin. "I'll be back by morning," Kira said. "I know, Mama." That was their routine. Kira took the night bus across town to the shopping center, where she worked as a cleaner from 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. The job was hard, physical labor, scrubbing floors, emptying bins, cleaning restrooms. The other women on the night shift rarely spoke to her, and the supervisor never remembered her name. She listened to music through one earbud as she cleaned, letting the rhythm distract her from the pain in her knees and the soreness in her back. Around midnight, she sat in the staff room, her body heavy with fatigue, and let her thoughts drift. She thought of Lonnie's drawing pinned on the fridge, of the time they danced in the living room to old soul records, of the nights when the power went out and they lit candles and made up stories to pass the time. She also thought of her past and how far away it seemed, of the white house in the suburbs she once called home, of the cold stares, of her mother's clipped voice, of Sam's sneering laugh, of being the only black child in a white household that reminded her every day she was different, tolerated but never truly accepted. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen. 1 new message. The number was familiar. "Kira, you're invited to celebrate the wedding of Samantha Elaine Carter and Daniel James Whitman. Saturday, November 5th reception to follow at the Carter residence, formal attire requested." Below, it was a brief note. "Please RSVP by the 15th. Bring Lonnie if you must." She stared at the message for a long time, her fingers tightening around the phone. Samantha's wedding. Of course, she was getting married in grand style. Of course, Meryl, Kira still couldn't bring herself to call the woman Mom, would be orchestrating it all. Of course, she was invited, as a formality, as a spectacle, not as family. Kira closed the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. By the time her shift ended, her legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. The night air bit at her cheeks as she waited for the early bus. She leaned against the shelter's glass wall, eyes half closed, heart heavy. She didn't know if she could go to that wedding. She didn't know if she could face them again. The sharp-tongued Meryl, the ever-smiling Sam, the guests who would look at her and see only what they wanted to see, the poor black half-sister, the stain on a pristine image. But then she remembered Lonnie's excitement at the idea of seeing a real princess wedding. She remembered the way her daughter looked at the world, with hope, not cynicism, with dreams, not memories. And she remembered that sometimes dignity wasn't about walking away. It was about showing up. When she finally arrived home, the The sky was already lightening with dawn. Lonnie was still asleep, curled into a warm ball. Kira leaned down and kissed her forehead. Then she pulled out the only formal dress she owned, a navy blue number she had worn once to a scholarship dinner years ago, and laid it gently across the back of a chair. She didn't know what the wedding would bring, but she would go. And this time she would not look down. The sun rose slowly the next morning, filtering through the dusty blinds and long golden bars. Kira stood by the kitchen window, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug, her eyes distant. On the table behind her sat the wedding invitation, its elegant gold embossing catching the morning light, a mockery of everything she and her daughter had come to represent in that family. She had officially RSVP'd the night before. Her message short and neutral: "We will be there." No unnecessary warmth, no false pleasantries. Just confirmation. And a silent warning to herself not to expect anything more than what always was. Lonnie was humming quietly in the next room, packing her little satchel with a crayon set and the drawing she had been working on all week, a picture of a wedding, all soft pastels and smiling faces. Kira glanced over and felt her chest tighten. She didn't have the heart to tell her daughter that the wedding they were about to attend wasn't that kind of fairy tale. By late morning, they were both dressed and ready. Kira had done her best with her navy blue dress, steaming out the creases, pairing it with simple pearl earrings she hadn't worn in years. Her makeup was modest, just enough to smooth the fatigue from her face. Lonnie wore a pale yellow dress, a hand-me-down from a neighbor, with a matching headband that made her beam when she looked in the mirror. The ride share pulled up 10 minutes late. Kira checked her watch, her fingers already tight on the strap of her handbag. The driver didn't speak much, which suited her. She spent the ride staring out the window, watching the neighborhoods blur from low-income to leafy and manicured, from chain-link fences to iron gates and trimmed hedges. Her jaw clenched when they turned onto the familiar cul-de-sac, lined with identical beige mansions and luxury sedans parked in driveways. It hadn't changed. It never did. The Carter residence stood at the far end, just as pristine as she remembered. White stucco walls, black shutters, a sprawling front lawn that had always been more for show than for play. A row of expensive cars was already lined up along the street. Kira paid the driver and stepped out, helping Lanny with her bag. "Wow," Lonnie whispered, eyes wide as she looked at the house. "It's like a castle." Kira gave her daughter a small smile and took her hand. "Let's go say hello." They walked up the driveway in silence. Kira's heels clicked softly on the pavement, each step tightening something in her chest. She pressed the doorbell and waited. After a moment, the door opened, and there stood Merrill Carter in her signature cream cardigan and slacks, pearls at her throat, and a frown barely masked by social grace. "Aurora," she said, her voice clipped as ever, using the formal name Kira had long since left behind. "And Lanny." Kira gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon." "You're late," Merrill said, stepping aside to let them in. "We're right on time," Kira replied evenly. The air inside was thick with the scent of polished wood, fresh lilies, and something rich and buttery wafting from the kitchen. Kira was immediately hit with a memory. Her first Thanksgiving here, age 11, still unsure of the rules, dressed too plainly, sitting at the far end of the table while Merrill corrected the way she held her fork. The entryway opened into a grand hallway, all white marble and towering ceilings. A chandelier sparkled overhead like a frozen waterfall. Lonnie looked up in awe, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Merrill walked ahead of them, her back straight, as though they were an inconvenience she was too dignified to acknowledge fully. "Everyone's in the sunroom," she said over her shoulder. "Go say hello before dinner." They followed her through the house, past the study, the formal dining room with its massive glass table, and the sitting room with furniture that no one ever touched. The house looked like a museum, lived in yet lifeless. In the sunroom, Samantha stood at the center of attention, perched on the edge of a cream-colored sofa. She was surrounded by a group of young women in matching pastel robes, their hair in rollers, sipping sparkling water from flutes. Her dress was designer, form-fitting, and perfectly tailored. Her smile widened when she saw them, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Kira," she said, rising with arms outstretched, "you made it." Kira returned the smile with practiced grace. "We did." Samantha's eyes flicked down to Lonnie. "And this must be the little princess. Look at you." Lonnie smiled shyly, clutching the strap of her bag. Samantha didn't wait for a response. She turned to her friends. "This is my half-sister and her daughter," she explained with a casual wave, like she was introducing a pair of distant relatives she barely remembered. Kira's eyes scanned the room. Among the unfamiliar faces, one stood out. A tall man with sharp features and a calm demeanor, dressed in a charcoal suit with a subtle plaid tie. He stood quietly near the bar cart, observing the interaction. His gaze met Kira's for a moment. Brief, searching. Daniel Whitman, the fiancé. Samantha reached for his hand and pulled him closer. "Daniel, this is Kira, my sister." Daniel stepped forward and extended his hand. His grip was firm, his smile polite. "It's good to finally meet you. Sam's told me about you." Kira nodded. "Likewise." Then he knelt slightly and turned to Lonnie. "And who is this?" "I'm Lonnie," the girl said, voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Miss Lannie," Daniel said, offering her a gentle smile. "It's a pleasure." Lonnie beamed. Kira studied Daniel while Samantha ushered the girls back to their seats. There was a quietness to him, a thoughtfulness that didn't match the arrogance she'd expected. He wasn't dismissive or forced in his charm. His attention lingered on people when he spoke to them. That alone made him stand out. "Come," Merrill said, reappearing beside them. "I'll show you to your room." They followed her up the stairs to a guest room at the far end of the hall, away from the others. The bed was neatly made, the decor neutral. There was only one small cot beside the queen-size bed, clearly meant for Lannie. "I hope this will suffice," Merrill said. "We weren't sure if you'd come." Kira nodded. "It's fine." Merrill turned to go but paused at the door. "Just try to stay discreet. Tomorrow's a big day for Samantha. Let's not make it about anything else." The door closed behind her. Kira sat on the bed and let the weight of the house settle over her. It was the same house that had never welcomed her. The same walls that had watched her every move with judgment. Yet now she was older, quieter perhaps, but not as breakable. That evening, a pre-wedding dinner was hosted in the backyard beneath a string of fairy lights. Tables were dressed in white linen, flowers arranged with meticulous care, and champagne flowed freely. Kira and Lonnie sat at a corner table near the heaters. No one joined them. Merrill fluttered among guests, Sam basked in attention, and Daniel mingled politely. At one point, he approached them with 2 glasses of lemonade and offered one to Lonnie. She accepted it with delight. "This place is something else," he said, looking around. "It always has been," Kira replied. He studied her a moment. "You've been quiet." "I'm used to being quiet in this house." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth. Daniel didn't respond right away, but his eyes lingered on her as though trying to understand something beneath the surface. Then he smiled at Lonnie's drawing lying on the table. "Did you make that?" Lonnie nodded. "It's the wedding. I drew everyone happy." He looked at the picture, then at Kira. "You're very talented," he said to Lonnie. Then, more softly to Kira, "She must get it from somewhere." Before Kira could answer, Meryl's voice cut through the air like glass. "Everyone! Samantha has something to say." They turned as Samantha stood and raised her glass. "I just want to say thank you to everyone who's made this weekend so special, especially my mother, who's been a saint, and of course, my amazing fiancé." Cheers erupted. "And, of course," Samantha added, turning her gaze toward the corner, "to my sister Kira for taking the time to join us. It means a lot." There was a pause. Someone clapped politely. Samantha smiled as if she'd offered a gift. Daniel looked down at the tablecloth, then back at Kira with an expression that was difficult to read. Kira just sipped her water and gave a small, unreadable smile. Later that night, back in the guest room, Kira tucked Lonnie into bed and sat beside the window, staring out at the lights below. The laughter floated upward, muffled but still sharp. She wasn't surprised. She had come here expecting nothing, and that's exactly what she had received. But for Lonnie, for that smile when she first saw the house, she would bear it. The next day was the wedding, and it would change everything. Morning came slowly, filtering into the room through sheer curtains that did little to soften the harshness of the sun. Kira sat on the edge of the guest bed, still in her sleep shirt, elbows on her knees, hands clasped. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did in moments of stillness, but this time they didn't drift toward Lonnie's school or her next paycheck. Instead, they pulled her backward, years backward, into the parts of her life she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The Carter household had never been hers, not truly, not even when she was legally adopted. Kira had been 11 when Meryl brought her home, a thin, quiet girl with deep eyes and a chipped tooth from a playground accident no one had bothered to fix. She remembered vividly the first time she stepped into this very house, how clean it was, how large and polished, how sterile. Meryl had led her by the wrist, not the hand, through the rooms like she was giving a tour to a temporary guest. Sam had stood at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed, her nose wrinkled like someone had brought a stray dog home. For a while, Kira tried. She washed her hands before touching anything, stood when spoken to, said thank you and I'm sorry more times than she could count. But Meryl's approval was always out of reach, and Sam's cruelty was effortless. When Kira accidentally spilled grape juice on the kitchen counter, it was Sam who exaggerated the mess, and Meryl who grounded Kira for carelessness. When money went missing from a wallet in the foyer, it was Kira's room that was searched first. No apology came when the cash turned up in Sam's dance bag. Even in school, the labels followed her. The black girl with the white family. Teachers treated her like a scholarship case. Classmates asked why her mother didn't look like her, or worse, whispered things about her in the hallways they assumed she couldn't hear. Kira stopped answering questions in class. She stopped raising her hand. She learned to become invisible. As she grew older, the space between her and the Carters only widened. Sam blossomed into the kind of teenage girl people adored, loud, confident, always at the center of the room. Kira, in contrast, learned to observe. She stayed home most weekends, reading or doing chores, while Sam flitted between parties and boyfriends. Meryl never asked Kira if she needed anything, never attended her science fairs or asked about her friends, but she bought her clothes occasionally, modest, shapeless things from clearance racks, and reminded her to be grateful. Kira remembered the moment everything changed. She was 17, working weekends at a grocery store and quietly applying to community colleges when she found out she was pregnant. The boy, Tobias, was older, charming in a way that felt like protection at the time, but he vanished the moment she told him. Kira had waited days before telling Meryl, building her courage. When she finally did, the woman's reaction was swift and cold. She didn't yell, she simply turned away and muttered, "I should have known." The next morning, Kira's things were packed. Not all of them, just the essentials as determined by Meryl. Clothes, toothbrush, school ID, no photos, no keepsakes. She was told to leave. The reason? There's only room in this house for one daughter who doesn't make mistakes. She moved into a friend's basement for a few weeks, got a job cleaning hotel rooms, dropped out of school, and started working full-time. By the time Lonnie was born, Kira had built a life from the scraps she'd been left with. It was hard. Every part of it was hard, but it was hers. Now, sitting in the house that had once rejected her, preparing to watch Sam marry a man who seemed too decent for any of them, Kira felt an old heaviness settle in her bones. Lonnie stirred under the covers, her small body stretching like a cat's, her curls wild and soft. She sat up, blinking sleepily. "Is it the wedding today?" she asked. Kira nodded and offered her a smile. "It is." Lonnie grinned, excitement already sparkling in her eyes. She hopped out of bed and began to chatter about flowers and dresses, about the princess she imagined Sam would look like, about how she hoped there would be cake. Kira let her talk, let her believe in the fairy tale. They dressed slowly, Kira helping Lonnie into her pale yellow dress, brushing her curls with patient hands. Then she turned to her own reflection in the mirror. Her navy dress was simple but elegant. She applied a touch of mascara, a swipe of tinted balm, and took a steadying breath. She would not let the house win today, not its silence, not its cruelty, not its history. Downstairs, the atmosphere buzzed with nervous energy. Caterers moved like dancers, arranging trays of hors d'oeuvres, positioning champagne flutes. Guests had begun to arrive, all in tailored suits and delicate heels, laughing politely as they air-kissed and complimented each other's jewelry. Meryl hovered near the front door like a sentinel, greeting people with grace, issuing instructions in hushed tones. When she saw Kira and Lonnie descending the stairs, she straightened and forced a smile. "You look fine," she said. Kira nodded. "Thank you." "No trouble today," Meryl added, leaning slightly closer. "Please." Kira didn't respond. The ceremony was held in the backyard beneath an arch of white roses and sheer fabric. Folding chairs had been arranged in perfect rows, and a string quartet played something classical that Kira couldn't name. She and Lonnie were seated near the back, away from the family section. No one looked directly at them, but Kira felt the glances, the questions. As the ceremony began, the crowd quieted. Samantha appeared at the top of the stone steps in a gown that shimmered like frost. Her veil floated behind her, and her smile was practiced to perfection. Meryl dabbed her eyes delicately with a handkerchief. Daniel stood beneath the arch, handsome in his suit, composed. His eyes scanned the crowd once, then found Kira. For a moment they held, and something passed between them. Not a smile, not a look of attraction, but something gentler. Recognition, perhaps, or something older. The vows were exchanged without flaw. The officiant spoke, the rings were given, and Samantha kissed her groom like a woman sealing a business deal. The crowd applauded, and the reception began. There were speeches, toasts, laughter, the clink of glasses, and the flash of cameras. Kira stayed seated, sipping water, watching Lonnie nibble at a cupcake with joy. And then Samantha rose. She tapped her glass and smiled. "I want to thank everyone for being here today. Truly, it means the world to me and Daniel. I also want to take a moment to thank my sister, Kira." Heads turned. Kira looked up slowly. "Yes," Samantha continued, "Kira, a single mother who raised a child all on her own, that takes bravery. So brave, in fact, that she never let a little thing like being different stop her from trying to keep up." A ripple of laughter, uneasy, but laughter. "And of course, little Lana, so precious. Truly, a reminder that family can come from anywhere." Kira's heart pounded. Her face remained still. "Anyone looking to adopt?" Samantha added with a smirk. "She's still available." More laughter, louder now. Kira's hands tightened on her napkin. She looked at Lonnie, whose face was pale and still. Her daughter's fingers reached for hers under the table, and she gripped them gently. "I'm just kidding," Samantha laughed. "We love you, Kira." And then Meryl stood, her voice loud. "Our Kira has always been the quiet one, reliable. A little dull, perhaps, but second-hand goods still have value, especially with a built-in child." This time the laughter echoed. Kira stood slowly, willing herself not to cry, not to shake. She turned to gather Lonnie, her breath shallow, but before she could move, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Daniel." He stood, face flushed, hands clenched. "Excuse me," he said, his voice clear and heavy. "I need to say something." The room froze, and Kira realized this was not going to end the way they thought. Silence washed over the room like a wave crashing onto a once smooth shoreline. The laughter choked in the throats of the guests who, moments ago, had been so eager to be amused. The clink of glasses ceased. The string quartet paused mid-note, and all eyes turned to the man standing tall at the head of the reception hall. Daniel's face was pale, but set with unshakable conviction, his expression the picture of quiet fury. Kira stood frozen, Lonnie's small hand still nestled in hers, her heart thudding like a war drum in her chest. The words still echoed, "Second-hand goods, built-in child," and though she had not flinched outwardly, every syllable had seared through her like acid. But now Daniel, groom of the hour, stood not beside his bride, but before the crowd, shifting the narrative in a way no one could have expected. "I wasn't planning to speak," he began, his voice even and calm, but each word held weight. "Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, of love, of family, of commitment. But it turns out the most important part of this day isn't the ceremony or the flowers or even the vows. It's the truth." The tension in the room thickened. Samantha, still standing behind her seat, visibly stiffened. Meryl reached for her champagne with a trembling hand. Several guests leaned forward as if waiting for a twist in a play they thought they had figured out. Daniel turned to Kira, his eyes locking onto hers with a gravity that sent a ripple through her chest. "Kira and I didn't meet for the first time last week, or even last month," he said. "We met years ago, long before I knew Samantha, long before any of this." Gasps and murmurs fluttered through the crowd like startled birds. Samantha's smile faltered, her face pinched in confusion and disbelief. "I was 24, Daniel continued. "My younger sister, Caroline, was dying of leukemia. She was in and out of hospitals for most of a year, and during her final few months, she was part of a palliative program. There were volunteers, people who gave their time to sit with patients, read to them, talk to them, help them feel human again. His voice cracked slightly but steadied. That's where I met Kira. Another wave of whispers spread through the room. Kira remained motionless, her hand tightening around Lonnie's. She wasn't just a volunteer, Daniel said. She was the only one who made my sister laugh, who treated her like more than an illness. She came in with a baby sometimes, this tiny, bright-eyed little girl who made drawings of planets and stars. My sister taped those pictures to the wall beside her bed. She called them her windows to somewhere better. Kira's eyes burned, but she did not let the tears fall. Caroline loved you, Daniel said to her directly. She said you reminded her what it felt like to be alive. The room was dead silent now. Samantha looked stricken, her lipstick a sharp red slash against her now pale skin. Meryl's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel turned back to the crowd. When I met Samantha, I was lost. Caroline had passed, and I was numb. I didn't want real connection. I wanted distraction. Samantha was that, beautiful, vibrant, untouchable. She never asked about my past, never questioned what I was grieving, and I let myself believe that was a good thing. He drew in a breath. But over time, I saw things I didn't want to admit. The way she spoke about people who had less. The way she treated waiters, assistants, her own family. The way she spoke about her sister. He looked at Kira again. The woman who once brought my sister joy, who raised a child on her own with strength and grace, was the same one I'd been told was difficult, or unrefined, or ungrateful. He let the silence sit, heavy and electric. So, no, he said finally, I will not be marrying Samantha Carter tonight. I cannot promise a future to someone who uses cruelty as comedy, who demeans the people who endure more than she'll ever understand. The collective gasp that followed was almost theatrical. A glass fell to the floor and shattered somewhere in the back. Samantha lunged forward, her voice high and shrill. "Daniel, this isn't funny. Stop. You're humiliating me." "I'm telling the truth," he replied, not turning toward her. "And if truth humiliates you, then perhaps it's time to ask why." Meryl was on her feet now, her voice sharp. "We spent a fortune on this wedding, on the venue, the food, the flowers. This is insane." Daniel faced her with quiet authority. "Send the bill to my office." He stepped down from the dais and walked toward Kira and Lonnie. Kira stood frozen, unable to process the scene unfolding around her. Her entire body trembled with the weight of 1,000 buried humiliations, of all the silent days and swallowed words. Her daughter looked up at her with wide, bewildered eyes. Daniel knelt beside Lonnie and offered a soft smile. "Do you remember the pictures you drew for a lady in the hospital?" Lonnie blinked, startled. "The ones with the stars?" He nodded. "That lady was my sister, and she kept them right next to her bed, every single day." Kira's breath caught. She hadn't known. Daniel stood, offering his hand to Kira. "Come with me." She stared at him for a moment, the room behind them blurring into insignificance. Then she reached out, took his hand, and stood. Lonnie grasped the side of her dress, stepping close. Together they walked out, past stunned guests, past flashing cameras and dropped jaws, past Samantha, who screamed Daniel's name with desperation in her voice, her perfect makeup smudging with each tear. Meryl clung to her, trying to contain the unraveling, but it was too late. Kira didn't look back. Her grip on Lonnie's hand was firm, steady. Outside, the air was cool and clean, untouched by the theater they had just left behind. Daniel guided them to a waiting car, holding the door open like it was the most natural thing in the world. They drove in silence for a while, the city slipping by in blurred lights and evening hush. Lonnie leaned against Kira's side, already dozing from the emotional whirlwind. Daniel's hands rested on the steering wheel, white-knuckled but calm. They ended up at a small restaurant tucked along the coast, its terrace facing the quiet rise and fall of the waves. A place far from chandeliers and crystal and cruel smiles. The hostess seated them outside, offering extra blankets for the night breeze. They sat beneath a canopy of stars, the sea breathing just beyond. For a long while, no one spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Kira looked up. "For what?" "For all of it. The way they treated you, the things they said, the way I didn't see it sooner." She shook her head slowly. "You stood up when it mattered. That's more than anyone else ever has." Daniel looked down at the table. "I guess I should explain why I was even with her in the first place." "You don't have to." He sighed. "After Caroline died, I needed to forget. Samantha was blinding, and I wanted to be blind." Kira nodded, understanding more than she could say. "But when I met you again," he said, voice quieter now, "something shifted. I remembered what real strength looked like, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that carries a child and a job and a world of injustice, and still shows up with grace." Kira swallowed hard, staring at the small candle flickering between them. "I didn't come to that wedding to make a scene," she whispered. "I know." They didn't speak again for a long time. Lonnie woke briefly, smiled sleepily, then returned to her nap with her head in Kira's lap. Daniel watched her with a softness that reminded Kira painfully of a father's gaze. Eventually, he pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded drawing, its corners frayed. "I kept one," he said. "One of the stars and planets pictures. From the hospital." Kira's breath hitched as she recognized Lonnie's childhood scribbles, tiny orbs and spirals, a bright yellow sun with a smiling face. "I don't know why," he added. "Maybe I knew I'd need it someday." Kira reached across the table and touched his hand. It was warm, solid, real, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to believe she wasn't alone. The night carried on, the waves whispering against the rocks, the stars overhead blinking in quiet witness to a chapter closing and a new one beginning. Kira sat with her daughter asleep beside her, a man who saw her for all she was across from her, and a heart no longer burdened with shame. Tomorrow would come, but tonight they had peace. The morning after the wedding, that wasn't, broke clear and windless. The sky stretched out in a calm, endless blue, as though the world itself had chosen to begin again. Kira awoke in a strange bed, the scent of salt and cotton linen in her nose, her limbs heavy but warm. For a moment, she didn't move. She just listened, to the distant crash of waves against rocks, to the gentle hush of the wind rustling sheer curtains, to the small, even breaths of her daughter curled beside her. It was only then she remembered they hadn't returned to Merrill's house. There would be no awkward breakfast around the cold granite island, no forced apologies, no shame passed from plate to plate like butter. Lonnie stirred first, blinking against the morning light, her curls flattened on one side of her head, her voice still thick with sleep. "Are we still by the ocean?" Kira smiled and brushed a hand over her daughter's cheek. "We are." They dressed slowly, the air between them light but full. There were no questions yet, not about what had happened, not about where they would go from here. They were still wrapped in the quiet bubble Daniel had given them last night by simply seeing them, hearing them, and standing up when no one else did. It was a fragile space, but for the first time in what felt like years, it was a safe one. Downstairs, in the tiny coastal inn Daniel had brought them to, the breakfast room was empty, save for one corner where he sat, a mug between his palms, watching the water beyond the window as if it held some answer. He turned when he heard their footsteps, and a smile rose naturally to his face. Kira, holding Lonnie's hand, felt her stomach flutter, not from nerves or fear, but something new. Or perhaps something old she'd buried long ago. Trust. They shared a quiet breakfast, interrupted only by Lonnie's wide-eyed wonder at the seagulls and her delight in discovering the inn served real maple syrup. Daniel didn't push Kira to talk, and Kira didn't ask what came next. But the air between them was different now, gentler, rooted in something deeper than shared history. After breakfast, Daniel excused himself briefly to take a call on the veranda. Kira watched him through the window, the way his brows knit together as he listened, the way he nodded once, decisively, before hanging up. When he returned, there was a different weight in his expression, but he said nothing of it. Instead, he asked, "Would you come with me somewhere today?" Kira hesitated only a second. "Where?" "Somewhere important." They checked out of the inn a few hours later, and Daniel drove them inland. Lonnie sat in the back seat, sketching quietly in her notebook, her tongue peeking out from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Kira watched the road unfold before them, winding through trees and small towns, unfamiliar and untouched by the glossy world Merrill had once curated. They stopped at a cemetery nestled among tall oaks, sunlight streaming through the branches in dappled beams. Kira hadn't realized where they were going until Daniel opened the trunk and carefully lifted a bouquet of white lilies. "This is where she is," he said simply. "Caroline." Kira felt something stir in her chest, a mixture of memory and guilt, affection and unfinished grief. She stepped out of the car, helping Lanny down, and they followed Daniel along the winding gravel path until they reached a modest headstone under a tree. It was clean, simple, and beautiful in its restraint. Daniel knelt first, laying the lilies gently against the stone. He traced his fingers over the carved letters: Caroline Whitman, beloved sister, dreamer, light, and whispered something too low for Kira to hear. Then he stepped back. Kira approached slowly. She hadn't seen Caroline in over a decade, but she remembered everything. The way she smiled even when the pain was unbearable. The way she'd squeezed Kira's hand and joked about hospital food. The way she called Lonnie Sunshine and hung her drawings like priceless art. Kira crouched and placed her hand on the grave. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaken, "for being kind, for seeing me." Lonnie, standing beside her, pulled something from her backpack. A small, smooth stone she had painted the night before in silence. It was pale blue, with a tiny sun in the corner and stars scattered across it. "I made this for her," she said softly. She placed it gently beside the lilies, then rested her fingers on the top of the headstone. "Thank you for being nice to me," she added in a whisper, her voice so sincere it brought tears to Kira's eyes. They stood together for a long time, the three of them, hands linked, the silence filled with something sacred. Not grief exactly, though that lingered, but reverence, memory, peace. On the drive back, Lonnie fell asleep in the back seat, her head lolling to the side. Kira and Daniel spoke in low voices, filling in spaces of their lives that had previously been closed chapters. Daniel admitted he had started noticing Samantha's cruelty long ago, but had ignored it because it was easier than confronting the truth. She had a way of twisting things, he said, and I let her. But when I saw you again, I remembered what genuine looked like, what grace looked like. Kira told him how she had raised Lonnie on cleaning wages and leftover tips, how every decision was a gamble between food and rent, how no one from the Carter household had offered a single ounce of help. She didn't even send a card when Lanny was born, Kira said, her voice low. And Meryl, she made it clear that I was the embarrassment, the burden. I was never her daughter. I was her lesson. Daniel reached across the console and touched her hand. She let him. That evening, back in the city, Daniel insisted on driving them home, despite Kira's quiet protests. She didn't want him to see her neighborhood, her building with the flickering hallway lights and stairwell that smelled of mildew, but he insisted. When they arrived, she unlocked the front door and pushed it open. It was small, cluttered, lived in. Lonnie's art was taped to every available wall space, and a stack of folded laundry waited on the couch. Daniel stepped inside and looked around, not with judgment, but with the same soft gaze he'd offered her daughter. "You've made a beautiful home," he said. Kira didn't know what to say to that. They stood at the door for a long moment when it was time for him to go. "I don't want to rush anything," Daniel said quietly, "but I want to be in your life, in both of your lives, if you'll let me." Kira didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer and kissed his cheek. Gentle, sure. Then she closed the door. Later that night, her phone lit up with messages. Some from curious friends, some from wedding guests, many from unfamiliar numbers asking for a statement, a comment, a reaction to the dramatic turn of events. But she ignored them all. Only one message mattered. A voicemail from Meryl. Her voice was tight with forced calm. "Kira, I don't know what story you told him, but you've humiliated your sister. She's devastated. We're all devastated. I hope you're happy." Kira listened once, then deleted it. She didn't need an apology, and she no longer needed permission. Instead, she pulled Lonnie close on the couch and read to her until the little girl drifted off to sleep. Then she sat alone in the quiet, the moonlight spilling across the floor, her heart finally still. She had not just survived, she had been seen, and for the first time someone had spoken truth to power in her name. That was justice, and it was only the beginning. In the days that followed the wedding, Kira found herself moving through the world with an unfamiliar sense of quiet clarity, like waking from a long and restless dream. It wasn't peace exactly. Peace took time, but there was space now. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without constantly shrinking. For years, she had become an expert at folding herself into silence, compressing her needs, her hopes, her voice into the smallest version possible, just to survive. Now, that instinct remained, but it no longer controlled her. The media frenzy around the failed Carter-Whitman wedding had lasted precisely 48 hours. Just long enough for a few tabloids to run headlines about the jilted bride and the mystery woman who had walked away with the groom. Kira didn't read them. She had no interest in their versions of the story, no desire to see her life reduced to clickbait or commentary. Samantha, by contrast, had tried to spin the narrative in her favor with a glossy interview that aired briefly on a local morning show. Kira only caught it because a woman from her building had stopped her in the hallway and asked if she was the sister with the kid. She made herself look like a victim, the woman had said, laughing, but you could see through it. That man didn't leave because of some misunderstanding. No, he hadn't. He had left because he saw the truth, and because he chose to act on it. Kira continued working at the diner for a few weeks after the wedding. It felt oddly grounding to be back among the grease-slicked counters and the sound of spatulas clanging against cast iron. The work was hard, and the pay remained insulting, but it was honest. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Her co-workers had heard rumors, of course, but Kira answered their questions with a shrug and a polite smile, and they eventually stopped asking. What changed, though, was Daniel's presence in her and Lonnie's lives. He didn't sweep in with grand gestures or try to solve everything at once. Instead, he showed up, in small, consistent ways that Kira was almost too afraid to trust at first. He picked Lonnie up from school when Kira's shifts ran long. He took her to the planetarium and let her drag him from one exhibit to the next, patiently listening to her explain solar flares and comet tails. He brought over takeout on the nights Kira was too tired to cook, and he helped Lonnie with math homework while Kira sat across the table balancing bills. Most of all, he listened. He asked about her day, about her plans, about the things she had long stopped believing anyone cared to know. One evening, after Lonnie had gone to bed, Daniel sat on the couch beside Kira and gently said, "I've been thinking about something. I know it's early, and I don't want to rush you, but I have a foundation. For women, families, survivors, it's underfunded, underutilized. I want you to run it." Kira blinked. "What?" "Not charity," he clarified quickly. "You're capable, strategic, organized. You've already been doing this work for yourself. I want you to do it for others, and be paid what you're worth." At first, Kira hesitated. The offer sounded too much like a rescue, and she had never needed rescuing. But Daniel's eyes didn't reflect pity. They reflected belief in her. And after long nights of thinking, of listing pros and cons, of imagining a life outside of survival mode, she accepted. The change was slow but profound. Kira quit the diner. She moved from their tiny apartment into a modest but sunlit two-bedroom on the edge of town. The building had working elevators, a clean stairwell, and even a patch of green where Lonnie could play. She started each morning not with dread but with purpose, checking emails from outreach coordinators, drafting budgets for shelters, meeting with city officials about community initiatives. She wore clothes that fit her with confidence and walked into rooms knowing she belonged there. Her office had a door with her name on it. Kira Monroe, Program Director. Lonnie flourished. She enrolled in a new school with a strong STEM program where her teachers praised her curiosity and called her a natural leader. She joined the science club, wrote stories about girls exploring galaxies, and insisted Daniel attend her school play even though he had to leave work early to make it. He did. He always did. As for Samantha and Meryl, they faded like shadows when the light is turned on. Samantha's social standing never recovered. Whispers followed her wherever she went, about the groom who left her, about the speech that revealed more than she ever intended. The friends who once flanked her at brunch began to disappear, drawn to shinier circles. Her attempts to rebrand herself on social media fizzled into silence. Meryl reached out twice. The first time was a carefully worded email full of evasive phrasing and unspoken blame. Kira didn't reply. The second was a voicemail left on her birthday, stiff and awkward, offering a brittle, "Hope you're well." Kira deleted it without a second thought. She no longer needed their validation. She had her own. One Sunday afternoon, nearly 6 months after the wedding, Kira stood in the office kitchen stirring sugar into her tea. The windows were open and sunlight danced across the tile floor. From the hallway came the sound of Lonnie's laughter and Daniel's deeper, amused response. They were building something together for the upcoming school fair, a cardboard replica of the solar system complete with spinning planets and blinking LED stars. Kira leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. For so long, she had been moving through fog, through loneliness, through quiet harm passed off as family obligation. She had learned how to endure in silence, how to hold herself together when everything tried to pull her apart, but now the silence was different. It was full of peace, not suppression, full of joy, not fear. Later that night, as they sat on the balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel turned to her. "You've changed," he said softly. Kira raised an eyebrow. "Changed how?" "You stand taller," he said. "You smile more. You look like yourself." She considered that for a moment. "Maybe I'm just not hiding anymore." He reached for her hand. "You never had to." Lonnie came outside then, carrying a plate of cookies she'd helped bake. They sat together, three quiet figures under a sky turning violet, their laughter rising with the wind. Kira didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what new trials or victories would come. But she knew this. She was no longer alone. She had a voice, a life, a love that didn't shrink her. And for the first time, she wasn't bracing for what might be lost. She was building something that could last. The first snowfall of the season arrived late, as though unsure of its welcome. It began in the early hours of the morning, a soft dusting of white that kissed the rooftops and turned the street silver. From the window of their apartment, Kira watched it fall in gentle spirals, wrapping the world in stillness. Lanny stood beside her in her pajamas, hands pressed to the glass, her breath fogging a circle as she whispered, "It's like magic." In many ways it was. Life had not simply transformed. It had unfolded, like the slow blooming of something long buried. Since the summer, the rhythm of their days had shifted into something steady and warm. The sharp edges of survival had softened. Lonnie had grown taller and bolder, her confidence no longer tentative but rooted. Her drawings now featured complex space missions, diagrams of interstellar travel annotated in careful handwriting. She had been selected to lead the Science Club's winter showcase. Kira, in turn, no longer woke with anxiety pressing against her chest. She walked into her office each day with a sense of ownership she had once believed was reserved for other women, those born into security, into networks, into worthiness. Now she knew better. Worthiness had nothing to do with where you began. That morning, Daniel arrived with coffee and cinnamon rolls from a bakery Lonnie loved, knocking rhythmically on the door before letting himself in. Lonnie greeted him with a tackle hug that nearly knocked the pastries from his hands, laughing as she pulled him into the kitchen to show off her latest school project, a three-dimensional constellation map that lit up in sequence. Kira leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, smiling at the sight. Daniel caught her gaze over Lonnie's head and winked. These moments had become common. Not dramatic, not storybook, but real. Shared dinners, school pickup, quiet evenings watching documentaries or reading aloud from books that Kira had once only dreamed of affording. What they were building wasn't flash and spectacle. It was the slow, sacred construction of family. Later that afternoon, they visited a local holiday market. Stalls lined the sidewalks, twinkling with lights and covered in garlands. Lonnie raced from vendor to vendor, her mittened hands grasping cups of hot chocolate and paper bags of roasted nuts. Kira and Daniel strolled behind her, fingers brushing now and then, the snow crunching softly underfoot. It was at one of the booths, a modest setup selling handcrafted ornaments, that Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Kira turned, surprised by the motion, as he held it out to her with a tentative smile. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said quietly, barely above the hum of the market. Kira looked at him, then at the box. She opened it slowly. Inside, cushioned in velvet, was a ring. Not gaudy or ostentatious, but delicate, vintage. An emerald stone in the center, framed by two tiny diamonds. It shimmered, not with wealth, but with memory. "It was Caroline's," Daniel said. "She gave it to me before she passed. Told me that when I met someone who reminded me what it meant to love, I should give it to her." Kira's breath caught. The sounds of the market faded, the cold forgotten. Her eyes stung, but she did not look away. She looked at Daniel, the man who had once stood at an altar beside another woman and chosen truth instead, who had seen her not as an afterthought or a symbol of shame, but as a person with strength and value, who had knelt beside her child and remembered the drawings that had brought light to his sister's final days. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know how I feel, and that I'm here, for you, for Lanny, for whatever comes next." Kira closed the box and placed it back in his hand. Then she stepped forward, wrapped her arms around him, and buried her face against his chest. No answer was needed. He already knew. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of snow and celebration. Kira's work with the foundation expanded as the city approved a new community grant, allowing her to open a second resource center on the east side. She hired 2 new case managers, built a youth mentorship program, and even returned to school part-time to finish her degree, something she'd abandoned over a decade ago when Lonnie was born. Lonnie, meanwhile, continued to thrive. She brought home a ribbon from the school showcase, not for the complexity of her constellation map, but for most inspirational presentation. Her speech had focused on exploration, not just of the stars, but of ourselves, our families, and the people we become when we let kindness guide us. One evening, as they decorated their modest apartment for Christmas, Lonnie climbed up on the couch and pointed to a bare spot on the wall. "We should hang a family picture there," she said matter-of-factly. Kira glanced up from the string of lights she was untangling. "We don't have one." Lonnie's brow furrowed. "Then let's take one." Daniel, sitting nearby with a mug of cocoa in his hand, chuckled. "What kind of picture?" "Us," Lonnie said. "Me, Mama, and you." The next Saturday, they visited a local photographer. No stiff studio lighting, no forced smiles, just a simple shoot in a nearby park, snow on the ground, Lonnie in her favorite red coat, Daniel in a scarf Kira had knitted him, Kira in her navy wool coat, still stitched at the hem where she had once mended it by hand. The 3 of them laughed through the session, Lonnie directing poses like a tiny film producer. When the final shot was taken, it showed all 3 of them seated on a wooden bench, arms entwined, eyes soft, snowflakes caught in their hair. It was that picture Kira framed and hung on the wall. That Christmas Eve, their living room glowed with soft light. The tree was small but full of ornaments, some new, some old, some handmade by Lanny. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine. A slow, instrumental song played from the record player Daniel had surprised them with earlier that month. Lonnie was asleep on the couch, curled under a blanket with a book resting on her chest. Kira and Daniel sat beside the fireplace, mugs in hand, silence between them warm, not empty. Outside, snow began to fall again, quiet and steady, the kind of snow that softened the world, that painted over cracks and erased harsh edges. Daniel reached into his pocket once more, and this time handed her the ring again, wordlessly. Kira took it, turned it over in her palm, then looked up at him. There was no speech, no dramatic pause, no orchestrated moment. Just this. A woman who had spent years surviving, now standing at the edge of something more. She slipped the ring onto her finger. "We're already a family," she said quietly. "This just makes it official." Daniel leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, and for the first time, Kira allowed herself to believe in forever. Outside the window, the snow kept falling. Inside, the warmth endured, and somewhere between the past they had overcome and the future they had chosen, a new story had taken root, not written in perfection or spectacle, but in truth, in love, and in the quiet, unshakable strength of being seen. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel, and if this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.